In the heart of the Swiss Alps, a lone hiker, Daniel Holt, was racing against the coming storm. The snow was falling fast, the wind howling through the jagged cliffs. What should have been a peaceful trek turned into a desperate search for shelter. When he spotted something impossible, a flickering light from a cave set high into the rock face. Daniel Holt wasn't your typical travel photographer. For over a decade, he'd been a war journalist capturing moments of conflict in the most dangerous places on Earth. His photos had exposed war crimes, toppled corrupt leaders, and earned him a reputation for chasing the truth no matter the cost. When he scaled the treacherous rock to reach the cave, he thought he was simply fighting for survival. But the moment he stepped inside, he realized he'd walked into something far worse. The room was impossibly preserved, an antique desk, an oil lamp still burning, and a steaming teacup as if someone had been expecting him. And then he saw it, a photograph resting against the lamp, a photo of himself taken from above, mid-climb. The timestamp? 15 minutes ago. What began as a desperate escape from the elements would become a descent into something far beyond human comprehension. The Alps would never give up their secrets, and after tonight, neither would Daniel Holt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Holt adjusted his camera strap, squinting through the gathering darkness at the jagged ridgeline above. The wind had picked up considerably in the last hour, carrying with it the sharp bite of approaching snow. He should have noticed the warning signs earlier, the dropping temperature, the heavy clouds rolling in from the north, the way the local wildlife had gone eerily quiet. But he'd been too focused on getting the perfect shot, on capturing that precise moment when the setting sun painted the Alps in shades of gold and shadow. Now, as the first few snowflakes began to dance around him, Daniel knew he'd made a potentially fatal mistake. The nearest town was hours away, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. His years as a war photographer had taught him to recognize dangerous situations, and this one was quickly becoming critical. He needed shelter, and soon. The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive in countless war zones, was already calculating options. There was a shallow overhang about half a kilometer back, barely enough to qualify as protection, but it might have to do. He turned to retrace his steps, then froze. There, halfway up the sheer face of the mountain, was a light. Daniel blinked, hard, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. The light flickered again, warm, steady, like an oil lamp or candle. It was coming from what appeared to be a cave entrance, though he could have sworn no such opening had been visible when he'd photographed this same ridge just hours ago. "That's impossible," he muttered, his breath forming clouds in the increasingly frigid air. The cave had to be at least 100 meters up, set into a nearly vertical rock face. Even if someone had managed to climb up there, who would light a lamp and then leave it burning? A bitter gust of wind cut through his jacket, making the decision for him. The overhang wouldn't be enough, not with a proper alpine storm rolling in. The cave, however impossible its light might be, represented his best chance of survival. Daniel checked his climbing gear, rope, carabiners, harness. All present, all secure. He'd done plenty of technical climbs before, though usually with better light and weather conditions. As he approached the base of the cliff, he felt that familiar tingle at the base of his skull, the same sensation he used to get when entering potentially hostile territory, camera in hand. The climb was treacherous. Twice, loose rocks nearly sent him plummeting to the ground below. The wind grew stronger as he ascended, threatening to tear him from his precarious handholds. But the light above remained steady, almost beckoning, and Daniel pressed on. When he finally pulled himself onto the narrow ledge outside the cave entrance, his arms were trembling from exertion. The storm was in full force now, thick snow reducing visibility to mere meters. Daniel turned on his headlamp and cautiously stepped into the cave. What he found inside stopped him cold. The cave wasn't just a rough hollow in the rock. It was a perfectly preserved room. An antique desk sat against one wall, its surface immaculate despite the harsh mountain conditions. Upon it, an oil lamp burned with that same steady light he'd seen from below. Next to the lamp sat a porcelain teacup, steam still rising from its surface. Daniel's photographer's eye took in every detail, even as his mind refused to process their implications. The desk was made of rich mahogany, its surface unmarred by time or elements. Several books lay open upon it, their pages crisp and white, showing no sign of the moisture that should have degraded them in this environment. The teacup was fine bone china, decorated with delicate blue flowers, and there, propped against the lamp, was a photograph. Daniel's hands shook as he picked it up. The image showed him from above, climbing the rock face, his face set in concentration. The angle suggested the photographer had been standing right where he was now, at the cave entrance. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken less than 20 minutes ago. He spun around, heart pounding, eyes searching the shadows at the back of the cave. The room seemed empty, but something about those deeper shadows felt wrong. They shifted in ways that didn't match the movement of his headlamp beam, as if they had weight and substance of their own. Then, from somewhere in those depths, came the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps. Daniel stood frozen, the photograph still clutched in his trembling hands as the footsteps drew closer. They were unhurried, deliberate, each one echoing off the cave walls with perfect clarity. And with each step, the oil lamp's flame flickered, casting long, impossible shadows that danced across the cave walls like living things. The storm howled, outside but in here. In this impossible room that shouldn't exist, time seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the darkness. Daniel's training kicked in. The same instincts that had kept him alive in countless war. Zones now screaming at him to move, to act, to do something. But before he could decide whether to retreat or advance, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, swallowing even the howl of the storm outside. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting the seconds between each intake of air, just as he'd done when photographing firefights. 1, 2, 3. His free hand found his camera, not as a weapon, but as something familiar, something real to anchor himself to. "Hello?" His voice sounded wrong in the cave's stillness, like it belonged to someone else. No answer came from the darkness, but the shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into shapes that vanished when he tried to focus on them. The rational part of his mind, the part that had always insisted on logical explanations, was working overtime. There had to be a reason for all of this. Perhaps the cave was some kind of abandoned research station or a forgotten military outpost. That would explain the furniture, the lamp, maybe even the tea. But not the photograph. Never the photograph. His headlamp beam caught something on the desk. Another photo, partially hidden beneath one of the books. With trembling fingers, he pulled it free. The image struck him like a physical blow. It showed a young boy, no more than 7 or 8, standing in front of a strange building with high Gothic windows. The boy was him, unmistakably him, with the same cowlick that had plagued his childhood photos. But he had no memory of this place, this moment. His childhood had been spent in suburban Connecticut, in a modest ranch house with aluminum siding, not whatever massive stone edifice loomed behind his younger self in the photograph. "That's not possible," he whispered. But even as the words left his mouth, the image seemed to shift. The boy's expression changed, his smile fading into something more uncertain, more afraid. Daniel blinked hard, but when he looked again, the photo was exactly as it had been before. A whisper floated from the darkness, his name, spoken so softly he might have imagined it. "Daniel." The sound sent him stumbling backward toward the cave entrance. This was too much, too wrong. He had to get out, had to think clearly in the cold mountain air. But when he turned, his headlamp illuminated only solid rock where the entrance had been. No opening, no storm, no escape. Just smooth, unbroken stone that looked as though it had been there for centuries. "No," he breathed, pressing his palms against the rock face. It was cool and solid under his touch. "No, no, no." He spun in a circle, lamp beam dancing wildly across the cave walls. The desk was still there, the lamp still burning, but everything else seemed different. The shadows were deeper, more substantial, and they moved in ways that shadows shouldn't. His mind flashed to another cave, years ago in Afghanistan. He'd been following a story about missing villagers, tracking leads with Elias. They'd found a network of tunnels beneath a mountain, and Elias had insisted on exploring deeper despite Daniel's protests. The memory hit him with unexpected force, the beam of their flashlights cutting through the darkness, the echo of their footsteps, the moment Elias had turned to him with that characteristic grin and said, "Sometimes the best stories are the ones that don't want to be found." The oil lamp flickered, pulling him back to the present. Something moved at the edge of his vision, a dark shape, almost human but not quite, gone before he could turn his head. His heart hammered against his ribs as another whisper slithered through the cave. "You were supposed to come sooner." The voice was familiar in a way that made his blood run cold. It wasn't quite Elias. The pitch was wrong, the cadence off, but it carried echoes of his friend's voice, like a distorted recording, played at the wrong speed. Daniel's hand tightened on his camera strap as he slowly turned toward the source of the voice. The lamp's flame danced wildly now, casting monstrous shadows that seemed to reach for him with elongated fingers. And there, just beyond the circle of light, something waited. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. "Show yourself." The answer came not in words, but in movement, a figure stepping forward from the darkness, wearing a face that could not be there. The figure melted back into the shadows before Daniel could focus on its features, leaving him with only an afterimage that made his head swim. A face both familiar and wrong, like seeing Elias through a warped mirror. His friend's features had been there but somehow stretched, distorted, as if whatever wore them hadn't quite figured out how human faces were supposed to work. Elias? The name caught in his throat. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years, not since the official search had been called off. Not since he'd stopped checking his phone every morning for messages that would never come. Something clattered in. The darkness ahead. A metallic sound, deliberate and inviting. Daniel's headlamp caught a glint of silver on the cave floor several meters away. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to find another way out, to do anything but walk deeper into this nightmare. But if there was even a chance, he moved forward slowly, counting his steps, keeping the desk with its still burning lamp in his peripheral vision. The object resolved itself as he drew closer. A voice recorder, the old kind journalists used to carry before smartphones took over. Its silver casing was covered in a thick layer of dust, but when Daniel picked it up, he nearly dropped it again. The device was warm to the touch, as if it had just been used. His hands shook as he examined it. The make and model were identical to the one Elias had carried everywhere, right down to the scratch on the corner from when they'd had to dive for cover during a mortar attack in Kandahar. Daniel had teased him about still using analog when everything was going digital, but Elias had just smiled and said, "Some voices only get caught on tape." The play button felt hot under his thumb. He pressed it. Static filled the cave, but beneath it, a voice. "Testing, testing, is this? Yeah, it's recording." Elias's voice, exactly as Daniel remembered it. "Daniel, if you're listening to this, two things are true. First, you finally decided to come looking for me. And second," a pause, followed by a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, "you've already come too far." Daniel's legs gave out. He sank to his knees, clutching the recorder like a lifeline as Elias's voice continued. "I found something here, Danny. Something that shouldn't exist. I followed the stories, just like those missing villagers in Afghanistan, remember? But this was bigger. So much bigger. There are places in the world that aren't places at all. They're more like holes, gaps in reality, and they're hungry." Static overtook the recording for several seconds. When Elias's voice returned, it was urgent, afraid. "Listen to me. The light you saw, the one that led you here, it's not a light. It's not anything human minds are supposed to see. I thought I could document it, expose it, but..." Another burst of static. "They're watching me record this. They've always been watching. In every photograph, every reflection, every shadow that doesn't quite match." And now they're watching you. Daniel's headlamp flickered once, twice. The beam dimmed, though he'd put in fresh batteries before starting his hike. "There's so much I need to tell you," Elias continued, his voice growing distant, distorted. "About the woman in the photographs, about what really happened that day in the tunnels. But if you're hearing this, it means they've already chosen you, just like they chose me. So remember this. Don't trust what you see. Don't trust what you remember. And whatever you do, don't trust that." The recording cut off in a burst of static. In the silence that followed, Daniel became aware of two things. First, the recorder in his hands was now ice cold. And second, the oil lamp on the desk had begun to sputter. "No," he whispered, but it was too late. The flame wavered, stretched, impossibly tall for a moment, then winked out. His headlamp died in the same instant, plunging the cave into absolute darkness. In that darkness, something moved. Not the strange, half-formed figure from before, but something larger, something that made the air itself feel thick and wrong, like trying to breathe underwater. And it was getting closer. The voice recorder crackled to life one final time. Through waves of static, Elias's voice whispered three words. "They're behind you." Daniel's hands moved frantically in the darkness, searching his pockets for matches, a lighter, anything. His fingers closed around a small box, the emergency, matches he always carried in his camera bag. With trembling hands, he struck one against the rough strip. The flame caught, illuminating the cave in weak, flickering light. Daniel froze, match burning down toward his fingers as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The cave had changed. The antique desk was gone, along with the oil lamp and photographs. In their place stood an iron-framed bed, its once white sheets now yellow and rotting. The bare rock walls had transformed into decaying plaster, strips of antiquated wallpaper peeling away to reveal dark stains underneath. The pattern on the paper shifted in the matchlight, flowers that seemed to writhe and twist when viewed directly. The match burned his fingers. Darkness rushed back in. Daniel fumbled another match out of the box, hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. As the second flame sputtered to life, his eyes were drawn to something on the bed. A leather-bound journal, its pages splayed open as if someone had just been reading it. He approached slowly, fighting the urge to run. The handwriting that filled the journal's pages was instantly recognizable. The same precise, squared-off letters he'd developed during his years as a photographer, making sure his photo captions would be legible even when written in terrible conditions. But he had never written these words. "Day 37, I think," the entry began. "The cave shifts again. Each time I close my eyes, something changes. The woman watches from the photographs, her expression different every time I look away. I tried marking the walls to track the changes, but the marks move. Or maybe I'm the one moving, sliding between moments like pages in a book." The second match died. Daniel lit a third with unsteady fingers, continuing to read. "Day? I remember things that haven't happened. Or maybe they did happen, but differently. There was a cave in Afghanistan. Elias went in. Or maybe I went in. Or maybe we both did, but at different times. The memories overlap like double-exposed photographs. I keep seeing my reflection, but it's wrong. Sometimes it's older, sometimes younger. Sometimes it's not me at all, but someone wearing my face like a mask that doesn't quite fit." The writing grew more erratic toward the bottom of the page, the careful letters deteriorating into frantic scrawls. "The light is a door, and the door is a memory, and the memory is a trap. And I've been here before, I've been here before, I've been here before." And there, at the very bottom of the page in handwriting so precise it could have been typed, "You'll forget soon. You always do." The third match guttered out. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for another, but the box was empty. His headlamp remained dead. The batteries that had been new just hours ago now useless. In the absolute darkness, the cave felt larger, as if the walls had retreated to some impossible distance. The air had grown thick and stale, carrying the musty scent. of old paper and forgotten rooms. A sound behind him, the soft rustle of paper like someone turning a page. Daniel turned slowly, though there was nothing to see in the darkness. But then, something. A deeper shadow against the black, moving with liquid grace. It cast a shadow of its own, somehow visible despite the absence of light. The shadow stretched across what had once been rock and was now rotting wallpaper. It was roughly human-shaped, but too tall, too thin. Its proportions subtly wrong in ways that made Daniel's eyes hurt. As he watched, unable to look away, the shadow turned its head to look at him. But the figure casting it hadn't moved at all. The journal slipped from Daniel's numb fingers, landing on the floor with a soft thud. The sound echoed strangely, as if traveling much further than it should have. When the echo returned, it had transformed into something else. A whisper, speaking words that made his skin crawl. "It's time to write the next entry." A soft glow began to emanate from nowhere and everywhere, as if the air itself had begun to phosphoresce. In that strange, sourceless light, Daniel saw him. Elias stood there, exactly as he had the last time Daniel had seen him. Worn leather jacket, camera bag slung across his shoulder, that perpetual half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But something was terribly wrong. His features seemed to shift and flow when Daniel wasn't looking directly at them, like wet paint running down a canvas. "You didn't look very hard, did you, Danny?" The voice was Elias's, but it echoed strangely, as if speaking through water. "When I disappeared, when everyone else gave up, I thought you, of all people, would keep searching." Daniel's throat constricted. He had searched, hadn't he? But even as the thought formed, memories began to blur. He remembered the official search being called off after 3 weeks. Remembered the pitying looks from their editor, the gentle suggestions that he take some time off. But after that, "That's not true," Daniel managed, but his voice sounded weak even to his own ears. "I looked. I followed every lead." The thing wearing Elias's face took a step forward. Its movements were too smooth, too fluid, like watching a film played at the wrong speed. "Did you check the coordinates I sent? You? The ones hidden in my last photos?" Ice formed in Daniel's stomach. He had never told anyone about the numbers he'd found scratched into the margin of Elias's final contact sheet. They had seemed random at the time, meaningless, or so he had convinced himself. "How did you—" Daniel started, but Elias cut him off. "Remember Kandahar?" The figure's smile widened slightly, showing too many teeth. "That night in the basement of the abandoned hospital when the mortars were coming down? You wanted to run, but I insisted we stay. Said the story was worth the risk." The memory hit Daniel like a physical blow. The air thick with dust and Cordite, their cameras clicking in the dark as they documented evidence of war crimes. Elias's voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes the truth is worth dying for." "Stop it," Daniel whispered. "Or what about Tehran? When we found those missing journalists?" The thing that wasn't Elias tilted its head at an impossible angle. "The ones who disappeared investigating the same stories we were chasing? You said it was a coincidence. I said it was a pattern." Each word drove deeper into Daniel's mind, bringing with it memories he had carefully walled away. The missing journalists. The strange patterns they had begun to notice. The way certain stories seemed to resist being told, as if reality itself was pushing back against their investigations. "I remember what you said that last night," not Elias continued, its voice growing more distorted. "When I told you about the caves I'd found, about the lights people had seen inside them. You said I was chasing conspiracy theories, said I needed to step back, get some perspective. I was trying to protect you." The words burst from Daniel, before he could stop them, carrying years of buried guilt. "Those stories you were chasing, they were making you paranoid. You weren't sleeping, barely eating. I thought if I could just talk some sense into you." "You thought—" "I was crazy," The figure's face rippled like a reflection in disturbed water. But I was right, wasn't I? About all of it. The missing people, the places that shouldn't exist, the things that watch from just beyond what we think is real. It gestured at the transformed cave around them. And now you're here, where I've been waiting, where they've been waiting. Daniel's camera felt heavy against his chest. Without conscious thought, he raised it like a shield between himself and the thing wearing his friend's face. Through the viewfinder, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Where Elias should have been, there was only a dark hole in reality, a void in the shape of a man. He lowered the camera with trembling hands. Elias was still there, but now his edges seemed to blur into the shadows around him, as if he was both more and less than human. "You were supposed to come sooner," the figure whispered, and its voice carried echoes of other voices, some familiar, some impossible to comprehend. "They've been so patient, Danny, watching you through every photograph you've taken since I disappeared, waiting for you to notice them waiting, and now." The phosphorescent light began to fade, but in the growing darkness, Daniel could see that Elias's eyes had become deep, dark holes, like the apertures of cameras focused on infinity. "Now," the thing that had once been his friend said softly, "it's time for you to see what I found." The thing wearing Elias's face dissolved into darkness, leaving behind only the afterimage of that terrible smile burned into Daniel's vision. As the strange phosphorescence faded, something fluttered to the ground where it had stood. A single photograph, its edges gleaming faintly in the dark. Daniel's hands moved of their own accord, picking up the photo before his mind could scream at him to stop. The image made his breath catch in his throat. It showed this cave, but not as it was now. The walls were smooth, unmarred by time, and elaborate gas lamps hung from iron brackets. A group of men in Victorian-era clothing stood around what appeared to be scientific equipment, theodolites, barometers, early cameras on wooden tripods. And there, at the edge of the frame, was a face he knew intimately, his own. But this wasn't a modern photograph artificially aged or manipulated. The image was a genuine albumin print, the kind used in the 1860s. He could tell by the specific way the silver had begun to tarnish at the edges, creating that distinctive sepia tone that no digital filter could truly replicate. The man with his face wore period-appropriate clothing, his expression serious as he adjusted one of the cameras. "This isn't possible," Daniel whispered, but the words felt hollow. After everything he'd seen, what was one more impossibility? He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded brown ink, someone had written, "Alpine Expedition, First Contact, 1868. Below that, in fresher ink, "The door opens when you're ready to remember." As if in response to these words, the phosphorescent light returned, but differently this time. Instead of filling the air, it seemed to concentrate along one of the cave walls, tracing the outline of what looked like hairline cracks in the rock. As Daniel watched, the cracks widened, revealing the edges of a doorway that couldn't exist. His survival instinct screamed at him to run, to find another way out, to do anything but approach that impossible door. But something deeper, something that had driven him to chase dangerous stories across the world, pushed him forward. He realized with a strange clarity that he was no longer trying to escape. The questions that had haunted him since Elias's disappearance, about the missing journalists, about the patterns they'd discovered, about the things that lurked just beyond the edge of perception, all of them seemed to lead here. The door was rough-hewn stone but covered in what looked like writing, or perhaps photography terms, technical notes about aperture and exposure times, scrawled in various hands across centuries. Some of the writing moved when he wasn't looking, directly at it, rearranging itself into new configurations. Daniel ran his fingers along the strange markings. They felt warm, almost alive under his touch. The sensation reminded him of the first time he'd developed a photograph in a darkroom, watching an image emerge from nothing in the chemical bath. That same sense of something hidden becoming visible, of reality revealing itself one layer at a time. What am I supposed to remember? He asked the empty air. The writing beneath his fingers shifted, forming new words. Everything. Daniel withdrew his hand sharply, but the decision had already crystallized in his mind. He had spent years taking photographs of other people's stories, documenting their triumphs and tragedies while keeping himself safely behind the lens. But this story, this impossible, terrifying story, was his. Had always been his, perhaps, waiting for him to find it. He thought of Elias, of his friend's last words about patterns and mysteries and things that didn't want to be found. Sometimes the truth is worth dying for, he whispered, echoing what Elias had said that night in Kandahar. The door swung open silently, revealing a passage that seemed to bend in ways that hurt his eyes to look at directly. The walls were lined with what appeared to be photographs, hundreds of them, their surfaces catching the strange light like mirrors in the dark. Daniel took one last look at the transformed cave behind him. The rotting bed, the peeling wallpaper, the journal with its warnings. All of it seemed to belong to a different reality now, one he was choosing to leave behind. He stepped through the doorway. The passage ahead curved gently, the walls covered floor to ceiling with photographs. As he moved closer, he could see that they were all of him, moments from his entire life, some he remembered, others he couldn't possibly have experienced. And in each one, half hidden in backgrounds and shadows, a figure watched. A woman's face, her expression changing slightly from frame to frame, as if she was moving through his memories like a ghost. The door swung shut behind him with a sound like a camera shutter closing. The photographs seemed to pulse with their own inner light, each image a window into a moment that may or may not have happened. Daniel moved slowly down the curved passage, his photographer's eye automatically cataloging details, even as his mind recoiled from their implications. Here was his graduation from journalism school, but the building behind him wasn't Columbia University. It was older, Gothic, with spires that pierced a strange violet sky. In the photo, he wore the same suit he remembered, but the diploma in his hands bore a name he didn't recognize. Next to it, a picture from his first war zone assignment in Iraq. Except the landscape had changed. The desert had become a series of impossible geometric structures, their angles defying physics. His younger self stood in the foreground, apparently oblivious to the impossibility behind him. "This isn't right," he whispered, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt uncertainty creeping in. The memories in his mind began to slip and slide, like trying to hold onto ice. Had it been Iraq? Or had it been somewhere else? Somewhere with violet skies and impossible architecture? A photograph near the floor caught his eye. It showed him as a child, maybe 6 or 7, standing in front of the house where he grew up. But as he watched, the image began to change. The aluminum siding of his childhood home rippled and transformed into rough-hewn stone. Windows elongated into Gothic arches. The suburban street behind him faded into mist, and there, in one of the windows, a woman's face appeared, watching. Daniel jerked back, blinking hard. When he looked again, the photograph showed only what it had originally. His childhood home, normal and unchanged. But now he wasn't sure which version was real, which memory was true. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His eyes fell on a stack of photographs lying in the center of the passage, arranged like files in an archive. Each had a name written on the back in various hands, some neat and precise, others hurried and frantic. Many were crossed out in red ink that looked disturbingly like blood. Thomas Blackwood, 1868, failed Maria Vasquez. 1923, failed James Chen. 1957, failed Sarah Kendrick. 1989, failed Daniel Holt. Present, in progress. The last photograph in the stack made his heart stop. It showed Elias standing in what appeared to be this very passage. He was younger than when Daniel had last seen him, but his expression was one Daniel had never seen before, a mixture of horror and understanding. On the back, in Elias's familiar, Handwriting. The pattern goes deeper than we thought. They're not just watching, they're collecting. And I think I'm next. A soft whirring sound filled the air, like an old Polaroid camera processing film. Daniel turned to see a blank square of photographic paper floating in midair. As he watched, an image began to develop on its surface, chemicals swirling and darkening to reveal a scene materializing in real time. It showed him, standing exactly where he was now, looking at the floating photograph. But behind him in the image, a figure stood, tall, indistinct, its features hidden in shadow except for eyes that seemed to glow with that same phosphorescent light that filled the cave. Daniel spun around, heart hammering. The passage behind him was empty, but the air felt thick, charged with potential energy like the moment before lightning strikes. When he turned back to the floating photograph, the image had changed. Now, it showed him turning to look behind him, and the figure had moved closer. Another soft whir, and a new photograph began to develop beside the first. The sound of rusting hinges pierced the silence. Further down the curved passage, a door that hadn't been there moments before swung open with agonizing slowness. Beyond it, a staircase descended into darkness, its steps worn smooth by the passage of countless feet across countless years. The floating photographs continued to develop, showing the figure drawing closer in each new image, its movements jerky and wrong, like frames missing from a film. In the latest photo, its face had become almost visible, a face that seemed to be trying to arrange itself into something human, but couldn't quite remember how. Daniel looked down at the stack of photographs, at all those crossed-out names. Had they all stood here just like this? Had they all seen their own images changing, their memories being rewritten, until they couldn't remember who they had been before the cave found them? The staircase beckoned, each step seeming to whisper with the footsteps of all who had descended before him. And behind him, though he didn't dare look, he could feel something moving, drawing closer with each photograph that developed in the air. He placed his foot on the first step. The stone was warm beneath his shoe, as if it had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Each step down felt like sinking deeper into the past. The rough-hewn cave walls began to change, stone transforming into cracked plaster, then into the familiar institutional green of military barracks. The air grew thick with phantom smells: cordite, dust, fear sweat, blood. "This isn't real," Daniel muttered. But his photographer's instincts had already kicked in. His right hand kept rising to his chest, reaching for a camera that had documented similar hauls in a dozen war zones. The motion was muscle memory as automatic as breathing. 7 steps down, and the walls showed bullet holes, their patterns hauntingly familiar. 12 steps, and bloodstains appeared, exactly where he remembered them from that night in Fallujah. 15 steps, and the phosphorescent cave light transformed into the strobing chaos of mortar fire. A scream echoed up from below, not quite human, not quite memory. It carried notes of something else, something that made Daniel's bones vibrate with recognition. He had heard that sound before, hadn't he? In that basement in Kandahar just before Elias had. The memory slipped away like water through his fingers. "Just the cave playing tricks," he said aloud, but his voice shook. The staircase stretched down into darkness, each turn revealing more steps, more memories. The walls continued their impossible transformation, cycling through every conflict zone he'd photographed. Bosnia, Syria, Afghanistan, each one perfect in its terrible detail. A child's doll lay on the 23rd step, exactly where he'd seen one in an abandoned school in Aleppo. When he looked again, it had become a combat helmet. Then a camera lens, shattered and bloody. Then something else, something that twitched and moved when he wasn't looking directly at it. Somewhere below, a camera shutter clicked. The sound echoed up the stairwell, distorting with each reflection until it became the report of a sniper rifle. "I never should have let you go alone." Daniel froze. The words had come from everywhere and nowhere, spoken in his own voice. They were the last words he'd said to Elias before their paths had diverged, before one had led to safety and the other to here. The staircase ended abruptly in a small landing. A single door stood before him, its metal surface corroded with age and marked with strange symbols that might have been photography terms or mathematical formulas or names written in alphabets that never existed. In the center of the door, a nameplate caught the strange light. The letters shifted as he watched, cycling through the names from the stack of photographs above, before settling on one. Elias Grant. Heavy chains crisscrossed the door's surface, their links massive and ancient. They looked like they had been there for centuries, and yet a scrap of paper was pinned to the door, the white sheet pristine despite the decay around it. Daniel recognized the handwriting immediately. How many photo captions had he seen scrawled in that same hurried hand? "If you open this, you'll never leave." Below these words, in smaller text, "But you already knew that, didn't you? You've known since that day in Kandahar, when you saw what was really in that basement. You just chose to forget." The walls around him had become a hodgepodge of every war zone he'd photographed, but wrong, perspectives impossible, details that didn't belong. A window from Bosnia looked out onto a desert from Iraq. A doorway from Syria opened into a jungle from Vietnam that he'd only ever seen in history books. And in every scene, half hidden in shadows and reflections, figures watched. Their faces were familiar in a way that made his stomach turn. People he'd photographed over the years, civilians and soldiers and refugees. But their expressions were all wrong, twisted into matching masks of hungry anticipation. A metallic rattle snapped his attention back to the chain door. The heavy links shuddered, as if something on the other side had grabbed them. Another rattle, stronger this time. The chains clinked against each other like wind chimes announcing a storm. A voice drifted through the gaps around the door. Elias's voice, but layered with others, some human, some decidedly not. "You can't keep pretending you don't remember, Danny. Open the door. See what you really photographed that day." The chains shook violently now, and beneath their rattle Daniel heard something else. The whirring of a dozen cameras, the click of shutters cycling at high speed, capturing every moment of his hesitation. The door began to buckle outward, as if something massive was pressing against it from the other side. The pounding grew more insistent, each impact making the door bulge like a membrane. Elias's voice filtered through, distorted but unmistakable. "Danny? Danny, help me! I've been waiting so long." Daniel's hand moved toward the chains of its own accord. How many times had he imagined finding Elias, bringing him home, erasing the guilt that had haunted him for years? The metal links felt warm, under his fingers, almost alive. "Don't." He snatched his hand back. This was what the cave wanted, what it had always wanted. Every photograph, every memory, every impossible moment had been leading him here, to this choice. Instead of touching the door again, he turned his attention to the walls. The conflicting war zones had settled into a single location, the basement in Kandahar. But unlike his memories of that night, the walls were covered in old radio equipment, dials glowing with that same phosphorescent light that filled the cave. One of the radios crackled to life, its speaker producing bursts of static that almost sounded like words. Daniel leaned closer, drawn by something familiar in the pattern of noise. "Date unknown." A voice emerged from the static, his own voice, but different, older, wearier. "If you're hearing this, you're me." Another version. Another attempt. "The door is a lie. The memories are lies. Don't trust what you think you remember about Kandahar, about Elias, about any of it. They've been watching us through every lens, every viewfinder, every reflection. Don't open the..." The transmission cut off in a burst of static. Behind him, Elias's voice had changed, becoming less human with each word. "You can't ignore me forever, Danny. You have to face what happened, what you saw, what you photographed." The pounding on the door took on a rhythm that matched Daniel's heartbeat. Or was his heartbeat matching the door? The distinction seemed to blur, just like the walls around him, just like his memories of that night in Kandahar. Had he really left Elias there? Or had Elias left him? The memory shifted and changed every time he tried to focus on it, like trying to photograph smoke. The radio crackled again. This time multiple voices emerged, overlapping. His voice, Elias's voice, and others he didn't recognize, all speaking in unison. The cave doesn't create, it collects, it watches, it waits. And when you're ready to see, really see. Daniel's eyes were drawn to his camera. The lens reflected the door behind him, but in its curved surface he saw something impossible. The chains were gone, had never been there at all. He spun around. The door stood bare, no chains, no rust, just gleaming metal and that nameplate, Elias Grant. No, Daniel whispered. The chains were real, I saw them. But even as he spoke, the memory began to fade. Had there been chains? Or had that been another trick of perception? Another false memory planted by the cave? The radio voices grew, louder, merging into a single sound that was almost but not quite human. Time to remember, Danny. Time to see what's really behind the door. What's always been behind every door, in every photograph, in every reflection. The pounding stopped. In the sudden silence, Daniel could hear something else. The whirring of film advancing, the click of shutters from countless unseen cameras. The door began to open on its own, moving with the smooth, deliberate motion of a lens iris expanding. Light spilled out, not the cave's phosphorescence, but the harsh, clinical light of the basement in Kandahar. And with it came a smell he'd been trying to forget for years, chemicals, but not photography chemicals. Something older, something wrong. The door swung fully open, revealing what waited behind it. Daniel screamed, but the sound was lost in the cacophony of camera shutters, capturing the moment his last illusion of reality shattered forever. In the doorway, silhouetted against absolute darkness, stood a figure Daniel knew better than his own reflection. The same leather jacket, the same camera bag, the same slight tilt of the head that had always preceded one of Elias's wilder ideas. But the eyes were wrong. They reflected the cave's phosphorescent light like a cat's, or like twin camera lenses catching a flash. You've gotten older, Danny. The voice was Elias's, but it moved through the air like smoke, curling and twisting in impossible ways. I haven't. Time doesn't work the same way here. Nothing works the same way here. The figure took a step forward. Its movements were too precise, too calculated, as if it had learned human motion from studying photographs rather than living it. Do you remember what you said to me that night? Not Elias asked, his head tilting at an angle that went slightly too far. About conspiracy theories? About needing perspective? His face shifted into a smile that contained too many teeth. Well, I found it. The perspective you said I needed. Would you like to see? Daniel's back pressed against the wall of radio equipment. Static whispered from the speakers, forming words just below the threshold of comprehension. You're not Elias, he managed to say. No? The figure looked down at itself as if checking. I suppose not. Not anymore. But I'm not Elias either. I'm what happens when you look too long through the lens. When you finally see what's always been watching back. His expression flickered between emotions like a rapidly cycling slideshow. What's been watching you, Danny? Through every photograph you've ever taken. The darkness behind the figure moved. There was no other way to describe it. The void itself shifted and rippled like the surface of a black lake. Daniel could hear it drawing breath, could feel its attention focusing on him like a camera zeroing in on its subject. They showed me everything, Elias continued, his voice taking on an almost reverent tone. Every photograph ever taken, every moment ever captured, they're all connected, you see? One vast network of frozen time, of trapped light, and in each one they wait, they watch, His face stuttered, like a film missing frames. They collect. They? Daniel's voice cracked. Who are they? Elias's laugh was like shutters clicking. Not who. What? They're older than light, older than time. Photography didn't discover them, they invented photography. Every camera is their eye. Every photograph, their memory. He gestured at the void behind him. And now, they want to show you what I saw, what I became. Daniel's camera felt heavy against his chest, its lens cap somehow missing. Through the viewfinder, he could see that the figure before him wasn't casting a shadow. Or rather, its shadow was moving independently, reaching toward him with elongated fingers. "You have a choice," Elias said, his face settling into an expression of almost paternal concern. "That's more than most get. You can turn around, walk back up those stairs, try to forget again. Live your life knowing what's watching through your lens." His head tilted again, too far, too smooth. "Or you can see the truth. About Kandahar, about what really happened that night, about what you really photographed in that basement." The void breathed again, and with its breath came whispers. Thousands of voices speaking in unison, some human, some decidedly not. They spoke of light and time and hunger, of moments frozen and lives collected, of a vast archive of existence stretching back to the first time someone had tried to capture light in a box. Elias extended his hand. The gesture was smooth, practiced, perfect, and therefore utterly wrong. "Come see for yourself, Danny. See what's on the other side of every photograph ever taken." His smile widened beyond what should have been physically possible, and in that moment Daniel saw what his friend had become. Not just a thing wearing Elias's face, but a door itself, an aperture through which something vast and hungry gazed into the world. "After all," Elias said, his voice now layered with countless others, "you've already taken so many beautiful pictures for them. Don't you want to know who's been collecting them?" Daniel stumbled backward, away from Elias's outstretched hand, but the void had already begun to move. It flowed around the figure like black water, reaching for him with tendrils of absolute darkness. He tried to run, but the darkness caught him, wrapped around him, pulled. The world shattered and reformed. Heat, dust, the weight of his camera in his hands. Daniel stood in a street he'd photographed 1,000 times, in a war zone that could have been any of a dozen he'd documented. Buildings rose around him, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes, but something was wrong with the light. The sun seemed to strobe, as if reality was being captured one frame at a time. Soldiers moved past him, their faces blurred like subjects photographed with too slow a shutter speed. Their weapons gleamed oddly, morphing between modern rifles and older weapons and things that had never existed in any arsenal. The air tasted like copper and chemicals, not gunpowder, but something he'd smelled before in a basement in Kandahar. "Get the shot, Danny." He turned automatically at Elias's voice, camera rising to his eye. Through the viewfinder he saw himself, another Daniel, younger, more earnest, taking a photograph of what should have been Elias standing against a wall. But it wasn't Elias in front of the other Daniel's camera. A woman stood there instead, her features shifting and changing with each tick of the shutter. She turned to look directly at him, her eyes reflecting light like mirrors, her smile knowing and hungry. The world flickered again. The war zone dissolved, replaced by endless mirrors. They lined curved walls that stretched up into darkness, each one reflecting Daniel, but wrong. In one, he was ancient, his face weathered by decades of seeing too much. In another, he was impossibly young, holding a camera that hadn't been manufactured yet. Each reflection moved independently, living out different versions of his life. A Daniel with hollow eyes pressed his hands against his mirror's surface, lips moving. No sound came through the glass, but Daniel could read the words. "Don't let them take your eyes. They start with the eyes." Another reflection showed him in the basement in Kandahar, but this time he could see what his memory had hidden, the things that had writhed in the darkness, the true nature of what they'd discovered. That Daniel's face was twisted in horror as he raised his camera, compelled to capture what no human should see. In yet another mirror, he was sitting at the antique desk from the cave's entrance, writing in the journal he'd found. But this Daniel's hand moved mechanically, his eyes vacant as something dark and fluid draped over his shoulders like a photographer's cloth. "We're all real," a voice said, his voice but layered with others. "Every photograph captures a moment, splits it off from the timeline, creates a new version, a new possibility, and they keep all of them. Every Daniel who ever picked up a camera, every Daniel who ever tried to capture the truth, The reflections moved like a wave, hundreds of versions of himself turning to face him. Some wore expressions of peace, others of terror. Some weren't quite human anymore, their features distorted by whatever lay behind the mirrors. One reflection, a Daniel wearing the clothes he had on now, stepped forward until his hands pressed against the glass. Behind him in the mirror, the woman in the photograph smiled, her face cycling through every expression she'd worn in every image where she'd hidden, watching him. The reflection's mouth moved. They're going to show you how to really see, how to capture not just light, but time, reality, soul. A hand touched Daniel's shoulder. He knew with horrible certainty that if he turned around, he would see himself. Another version, another possibility. Another Daniel who had made different choices in this endless maze of mirrors and memories. The hand squeezed gently, its touch both familiar and utterly wrong, like being touched by your own reflection. Time to take the photograph you were always meant to capture, his own voice whispered from behind him. The one that will make you understand what Elias understood, what we all understood eventually. The mirrors began to fog, their surfaces becoming dark and fluid, like developing photographs. In each one, something moved behind the glass, reaching toward him with hands made of shadow and light and time itself. Daniel turned, bracing himself for another version of his own face. Instead, he found himself looking at something that made his mind recoil. A figure that was almost human, the way a photograph negative is almost a picture. Its features shifted constantly, cycling through every face he'd ever worn, every expression he'd ever captured, every possible version of Daniel Holt that had ever existed or could exist, but its eyes remained constant. They were cameras. Not like cameras, but actual apertures opening onto absolute darkness. Irises expanding and contracting as they focused on him with horrible precision. Knowledge flooded into Daniel's mind, not in words but in images. Flashes of light, fragments of time, memories that belonged to other versions of himself. He saw a Daniel who had opened the basement door in Kandahar and stepped through willingly. Another who had tried to run, only to find every exit leading back to the same dark room. One who had gotten so lost in the mirrors that he'd forgotten his own face and borrowed others instead. "You're what's been watching," Daniel whispered. Through every lens, every reflection. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. You're what photography really is. The watcher's face settled momentarily into a smile that contained every smile he'd ever photographed. Its voice, when it came, wasn't sound but pure understanding downloaded directly into his consciousness. We are the space between moments. The dark behind every lens. The truth. Every photographer senses, but never sees. Images continued to flood. Daniel's mind, the first camera obscura ever created, and the ancient things that had writhed in excitement at humanity's first attempt to trap light. The invention of photography, and how these entities had shaped it, guided it, used it to watch, and wait, and collect. Every photograph takes something from the world, splits it off, creates a new timeline, a new possibility. We keep them all. The mirrors around them had become fluid, showing scenes from countless timelines. In one, Daniel had become a famous war photographer, his work changing the course of conflicts, but his images showed things that hadn't been there when the photos were taken, horrors that only appeared after the film was developed. In another, he had never picked up a camera at all, but the things had found him anyway, reaching through every reflective surface until he had no choice but to see. And now you understand why we chose you, why we chose every version of you, why we sent the woman to watch, to guide, to prepare. The watcher's face cycled through images of the woman in the photographs, appearing in the background of every significant picture Daniel had ever taken, moving closer with each frame, leading him here. And Elias? Daniel's voice cracked. Was he just another test? Another version? The watcher's smile contained multitudes. Elias was like you, a perfect lens, a perfect observer. He learned to see truly, to capture not just light, but reality itself. Behind the watcher, a door materialized. not made of wood or metal, but of pure light frozen in the act of bending. Through its translucent surface, Daniel could see impossible things: the true shape of time, the mathematics of light, the vast archive where every photograph ever taken was stored and studied by things that had waited in darkness since before humanity learned to dream. The watcher stepped aside, its camera eyes never leaving Daniel's face. Your choice: stay and learn to truly see, or leave, knowing what watches through your lens, knowing that every photograph you take feeds us, grows us, brings us closer to the surface of your world. The door of light pulsed like a heartbeat, like a shutter opening and closing, each beat revealing new impossibilities beyond its threshold. The watcher stood perfectly still, patient as only something eternal can be, waiting for Daniel's decision. In the mirrors around them, countless other Daniels faced countless other choices, each creating new branches, new possibilities, new versions for the things behind the light to collect and keep. The door of light pulsed before him, each beat sending ripples through reality like waves through a photographic developer. The watcher remained motionless, its camera eyes recording every microsecond of Daniel's hesitation, but its silence spoke volumes. It didn't need to convince him. Every choice he'd ever made had led him here, to this threshold, to this moment. Daniel stepped closer to the door, and something clicked in his mind, a recognition so profound it made him stumble. He'd seen this doorway before, in one of the altered photographs from his childhood. But it hadn't been made of light then. It had been the front door of his childhood home, photographed at an angle that made it look somehow wrong, somehow more than just a door. His hand moved toward the surface of light. The moment his fingers made contact, images exploded through his consciousness. A Daniel choosing to stay, allowing the things behind the photographs to hollow him out, to wear him like a suit, to use his eyes and hands to capture more moments, more possibilities, more versions of reality. Another Daniel running, making it all the way back to the surface, back to his life, only to find that every photograph he took showed things that hadn't been there, horrors that grew clearer with each passing day, until he had no choice but to return to the cave. A Daniel who thought he could outsmart them, who tried to destroy every camera, every reflection, every surface that could be used to watch, only to discover that they had already replaced his eyes with their own. That he had become nothing but a lens through which they viewed the world. Thousands of Daniels, thousands of choices, all of them leading back here, to this door, to this moment. He stumbled forward, through the threshold of light, and the cave vanished. He stood in the entryway of his childhood home in Connecticut, exactly as it had been 25 years ago. The same faded wallpaper his mother had always meant to replace. The same scuff marks on the hardwood floor from where he'd practiced hockey stops in his socks. The same afternoon light slanting through the windows at impossible angles, creating shadows that shouldn't exist. But something was wrong with the quality of the air, as if reality here was thin, provisional, like a photograph that had been retouched too many times, losing definition with each adjustment until the original image was barely visible beneath the alterations. This wasn't memory, he realized. This wasn't even the cave playing with his past. This was something far worse. Reality being reconstructed around him, built from fragments of photographs and memories and moments that had been collected over decades. The watcher wasn't testing his courage or his willingness to see the truth. It was testing how much of himself he could hold on to while reality itself was rewritten. "Danny, is that you?" His mother's voice called from the kitchen, exactly as it had thousands of times before. But she had died 12 years ago, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and regret. He had taken her last photograph, a single Polaroid that had developed wrong, showing not her peaceful face but something else. Something that had made him burn the image before anyone else could see it. "I'm making your favorite," her voice continued, carrying notes of something else beneath the familiar warmth, something that clicked and whirred like a camera mechanism. "Come into the kitchen, sweetheart. Let me look at you." The shadows in the hallway lengthened, reaching for him with fingers made of darkness and silver nitrate. And behind him, though, he didn't dare turn to look. He could feel the watcher's presence, its aperture eyes recording every moment of his realization that this wasn't just a test or a trap. It was a transformation, and it had already begun. Daniel's feet moved without his permission, carrying him toward the kitchen. Everything was exactly as he remembered it. The worn linoleum floor, the yellow curtains his mother had sewn herself, the perpetual smell of coffee and chocolate chip cookies. Too exact, too perfect, like a photograph that had been retouched until it lost all its natural imperfections. "I made your favorite," his mother's voice called again. "Meatloaf and mashed potatoes." But that wasn't right. His favorite had been his father's lasagna, hadn't it? The memory shifted and blurred as he tried to focus on it, like a photograph left too long in developer fluid. Maybe it had been meatloaf. Maybe it had always been meatloaf. He found himself sitting at the kitchen table, though he couldn't remember moving to sit down. His body felt wrong, smaller, younger. When he looked at his hands, they were a child's hands, unmarked by the scars and calluses of decades handling cameras in war zones. His mother moved around the kitchen, her movements too smooth, too deliberate. She set plates on the table with precise mechanical gestures. But when Daniel tried to look directly at her face, there was nothing there. Just a blur, like a face photographed while moving. All features lost to motion. "Eat up, sweetheart," the blur that was his mother said. "You'll need your strength for what's coming." The room flickered like a film missing frames. For a split second, Daniel saw another version of the kitchen, walls stained with age and darkness, windows boarded up, table rotting and covered in decades of dust. In that version, something sat in his mother's chair, something that was neither human nor memory, its form assembled from stolen photographs and borrowed moments. The kitchen snapped back to normal, but now a photograph lay on the table between them. It hadn't been there a moment ago, hadn't been there in his real memories of childhood dinners. Daniel's hands shook as he picked it up. The image showed this exact moment. Him sitting at the table, the plates of food, the yellow curtains. But where his mother should have been, a shadow sat instead. Not a human shadow, but something vast and dark, its edges fractal and impossible, spreading through the photograph like ink through water. As he stared at it, details emerged from the darkness. Camera lenses where eyes should be, apertures opening and closing in rhythmic patterns, silver nitrate tentacles coiling around the chair. "Danny," his mother's voice said, but it no longer sounded like her. It clicked and whirred like a camera advancing film. "Look at me, sweetheart. Let me see how you've grown." Daniel's grip tightened on the photograph. The shadow in the image was moving, turning its head with the liquid grace of something that had never been bound by human anatomy. Camera eyes focused on the viewer, on him, and he could feel the weight of their gaze across time and space and possibility. "This isn't real," he whispered, but even as he spoke, he felt his memories shifting again. Had his mother always been a blur? Had there always been a darkness sitting at their table watching him grow, watching him learn to see the world through its eyes? The photograph in his hands was changing too. The shadow expanded, consuming more of the image with each passing second. The kitchen in the background warped and twisted, revealing glimpses of other places, the cave, the basement in Kandahar, countless other locations where the barriers between reality and photography had worn thin. And then, with horrible deliberation, the figure in the photograph turned its head to look directly at him. Not at the camera, not at the version of himself captured in the image, but at him, now, holding the photograph. Its face was a collage of every photograph ever taken, every moment ever captured, every reality ever split off and collected by the things behind the light. "My sweet boy," it said, in a voice that contained his mother's and countless others. "Always so good at seeing what others miss, just like we taught you to be." The photograph began to move like a video, like a window into another reality that was reaching through to claim this one. And in the chair across the table, his mother's blur was solidifying into something else entirely. Reality fractured like a dropped mirror. The kitchen, the memory, the lie, the trap, shattered around.
Daniel.
When his vision cleared, he stood in a narrow corridor of rough stone, lit by that same impossible phosphorescence that filled the rest of the cave. And at the end of the corridor, she waited. The woman in the photographs stood perfectly still, exactly as she had appeared in countless images throughout his life. Her presence was both familiar and impossible, like a word on the tip of his tongue or a face glimpsed in a dream. She wore a simple dark dress that seemed to absorb the cave's light, making her edges blur into the shadows around her. "I know you," Daniel said, though he couldn't say how or when or where he knew her from. Had she been a subject in one of his photographs? A stranger passed on the street? Or something else entirely? Something that had worn the shape of human interaction like a mask? She smiled, and the expression was wrong, not because it was inhuman, but because it was too human, too perfect, as if assembled from every smile ever captured on film. When she spoke, the words came in Elias's voice, barely above a whisper. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that don't want to be found. The phrase hit Daniel like a physical blow. Elias had said those exact words in the basement in Kandahar, just before what? The memory slipped away like light through a closing aperture. The woman took a step forward, her movements liquid and precise. In her hand she held a photograph, not an old one, not a memory or a possibility, but something new, something being created in this very moment. She extended it toward him. Daniel's hands shook as he took it. The image showed him standing exactly where he was now, in this corridor, looking at this photograph. But where his face should have been, there was only a blank space, a void in the shape of human features. As he watched, the emptiness began to spread, erasing more of him with each passing second. "You've been trying to warn me," he realized, looking up at her. "In every photograph, every reflection, you've been trying to show me what's coming." Her face shifted, cycling through expressions he recognized from 1,000 different photographs where she'd hidden in the background. Fear, concern, determination, warning. Each one perfect, each one practiced, each one borrowed from someone else's captured moment. She opened her mouth to speak again, but this time the voice that emerged was a combination of many. Elias, his mother, himself, and others he didn't recognize. They collect more than moments, Daniel. More than memories. They collect observers, those who truly see. And you've seen so much. The photograph in his hands was still changing. The void where his face had been was taking shape, forming into something else. A nest of apertures and lenses. A window into the vast dark that waited behind every photograph ever taken. "But you're one of them," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. "Aren't you?" Her smile turned sad, revealing too many teeth that gleamed like silver in developer fluid. "I was like you once. A photographer, an observer. Until I learned what really lives in the space between moments." She gestured at her own face, which rippled like disturbed water. "Now I'm what happens when you're caught between the camera and the truth, between seeing and being seen." She raised her hand, pointing behind him. Daniel could feel it now. The weight of the watcher's gaze, heavy as mercury, patient as entropy. When he looked back at the woman, her edges had begun to blur. Reality, flowing around her like light around a black hole. "They're going to unmake you," she whispered, her voice fracturing into static and shutter clicks, "just like they unmade me. Just like they unmade Elias. Unless..." The corridor seemed to stretch, the walls pulling away into impossible distances. And in every shadow, in every reflection, in every mote of dust catching the cave's phosphorescent light, cameras watched and waited and hungered. Daniel turned to face the watcher, his fear crystallizing into something harder, sharper. "Show me," he demanded. "Show me everything. What happened to Elias? What's really in this cave? What you are." The watcher's camera eyes focused on him. with terrible precision. Then the world dissolved into pure information. He was Elias walking through the basement in Kandahar. But now he could see what the cameras had captured that day. Vast shapes moving through walls that weren't walls at all, but thin places in reality. Entities that existed in the space between light and shadow, between moment and memory, between is and was. He was Thomas Blackwood in 1868, setting up his camera in this very cave, not understanding that the apparatus he'd brought to capture the light was actually a door, a trap, an invitation. The first photograph he took showed something standing behind him, something that would wear his face for the next 150 years. He was Maria Vasquez in 1923, developing photographs in a dark room when the chemicals began to move, with purpose, with hunger, reaching for her eyes with tendrils of silver nitrate. She tried to run, but every photograph she'd ever taken had created a map to find her, a web to catch her, a truth she couldn't escape. He was James Chen, Sarah Kendrick, and countless others, all photographers, all observers, all consumed by the things that lived in the space between moments. We are not one, the watcher's voice pressed into his mind. We are many. Every photographer who ever saw too much, every observer who learned to truly see. We became what we photographed, and what photographed us. The vision shifted. He saw Elias again, but not as he remembered him. His friend stood in an impossible space surrounded by photographs floating in void. His face kept changing, sometimes his own, sometimes others, sometimes nothing. Human at all. They showed me everything, Danny. Elias's voice echoed through time and memory. Every photograph ever taken, every moment ever captured. They're all connected, all alive, all hungry. Your friend understood. He chose to see, to become, to join the archive of all things. Daniel watched as Elias raised his camera one final time, photographing the thing that would unmake him. In the developed image, Elias's features had already begun to blur, to transform, to become part of the vast network of captured light and stolen time that filled the spaces between reality. Now you must choose. The vision cleared. Daniel stood in the cave again, but now he could see it truly, not a physical space at all, but a confluence of every photograph ever taken here, every moment ever captured, every reality ever split off and collected. The walls weren't stone, but layer upon layer of images, each one a window into another possibility, another timeline, another version of truth. Surrender, the watcher offered. Become part of us. Learn to see as we see, to capture not just light, but reality itself, or fight. Try to break the cycle, but know that every photograph you've ever taken has already bound you to us. Every image you've captured has already given us a piece of your soul. The cave trembled. Photographs began to fall from the walls like leaves from a dying tree. The air itself seemed to crack, showing glimpses of the void beyond, the vast archive where every captured moment was stored and studied by things that had never been human. Daniel's camera felt heavy against his chest. He could feel the weight of every photograph he'd ever taken, every moment he'd ever frozen, every truth he'd tried to capture, each one a thread connecting him to this place, to these entities, to the hungry dark behind every lens. The watcher's face shifted between forms, Elias, his mother, the woman in the photographs, himself, and things that had never had faces, at all, waiting for his choice. The cave shuddered again, reality buckling under the weight of too many possibilities existing in one space. Time was running out, and Daniel could feel the truth pressing in from all sides. No matter what he chose, he would become another photograph in their collection. The only question was whether he would be preserved or consumed. The cave shuddered again, photographs raining down like burning leaves. Each one burst into light as it hit the ground, releasing fragments of captured moments, voices, shadows, pieces of realities that should never have been frozen. The walls weren't just cracking now, they were unraveling, showing the void between moments where the things behind the photographs lived. The watcher moved toward Daniel with terrible purpose, its camera eyes contracting with hunger. Every step it took left impressions in reality. Footprints made of collected moments, each one showing a different version of how this scene could play out. In most of them, Daniel was already changing, his features blurring into something that was more lens than flesh. But through the chaos of collapsing reality, Daniel saw movement. The woman in the photograph stood apart from the destruction, her form more solid than he'd ever seen it. She made no sound, but her gestures were urgent, desperate. She pointed to something behind her, a patch of normal darkness, a piece of reality that didn't writhe with captured moments and hungry apertures. An exit, maybe the last one. Your choice is an illusion. The watcher's voice pressed into his mind. You have already chosen. Every photograph you've ever taken was a choice to see, to know, to become. The floor cracked beneath Daniel's feet, the fissures spreading like spider webs across reality itself. Through the gaps he could see the vast archive below, endless shelves stretching into infinity, storing every photograph ever taken, every moment ever frozen, every possibility ever split off from the main flow of time. Shapes moved through those shelves, things that had once been photographers, observers, people who had looked too long and seen too much. He recognized some of them. Thomas Blackwood, his 19th century face now a nest of brass lenses and silver mirrors. Maria Vasquez, her form flowing like developer fluid as she filed away realities. James Chen, Sarah Kendrick, all the others from that stack of marked photographs, now part of the vast machinery of observation that kept the archive running. The watcher reached for him with hands that were made of captured light and stolen time. You cannot escape what you are, what you've always been, a perfect observer, a perfect lens. Another crack split the floor. Daniel stumbled, nearly falling into the infinite archive below. The void pulled at him, promising knowledge, promising understanding, promising to show him every photograph ever taken and every truth behind them. For a moment he wavered. The need to know, to understand, to finally see. What lay behind every photograph he'd ever taken, it was overwhelming. Wasn't that why he'd become a photographer in the first place? To capture truth? To understand? The woman in the photographs moved again, her gestures more frantic now. And in her face, her borrowed, assembled, impossible face, Daniel saw something he recognized. Not knowledge, not understanding, just the simple human need to survive. He ran. The cave screamed, not with sound but with light. Every photograph on the walls erupted at once, releasing their captured moments in a flood of frozen time. Daniel sprinted through fragments of war zones, pieces of celebrations, shards of everyday moments that had been trapped in silver nitrate and chemical baths. The floor continued to splinter beneath his feet. Each step could be his last, could send him tumbling into the archive where the things behind the photographs would unmake him, remake him, transform him into another curator of captured light. But the exit was there, a rectangle of pure darkness that seemed to pulse like a shutter, opening and closing, offering escape in the fragments of time between moments. He was almost there, almost. A figure stepped into his path, silhouetted against the exit. Even before it moved, Daniel knew who it would be, knew what choice he would have to make to reach that final darkness. The figure standing in the exit was him, but wrong, twisted, transformed by years or decades or centuries in the cave. Its eyes were perfect black circles, like camera lenses pointed at infinity. Its skin had the metallic sheen of silver nitrate, and its movements left trails in the air like long exposure photographs. You can't leave, it said in Daniel's voice, stripped of all emotion, all humanity. You already chose. You chose the moment you first picked up a camera, the moment you first tried to capture truth in little boxes of light and chemicals. Behind Daniel, the cave continued to collapse. He could feel reality unraveling, pulling at the edges of his thoughts, trying to unmake him. The watcher's presence pressed closer, its hunger radiating like heat from an overused flashbulb. I'm not you, Daniel said. But even as the words left his mouth, he saw the truth in the reflection's face. The same lines, the same scars, the same obsessive need to document, to understand, to see. This wasn't just a possible future. This was him. Another version, another timeline, another choice made in this endless maze of captured moments. Aren't you? The reflection's face rippled like disturbed water. I thought I could escape too. Thought I could run from what I'd seen, what I'd photographed. But every image I ever captured was a thread leading back here. Every moment I froze was a promise to them. It gestured at the void beyond the cave walls, where things made of light and shadow moved with horrible purpose. The floor cracked again. Through the widening fissures, Daniel could see the infinite archive below, could see versions of himself filing away realities, cataloging moments, becoming part of the vast machinery of observation that kept this place running. They're not just collecting photographs, the reflection continued, its voice taking on the mechanical click of a shutter. They're collecting us, the ones who see truly, the ones who understand that every photograph steals something from the world, creates a new reality, a new possibility. And we're so good at it, Danny. So perfect at seeing what others miss. Movement behind the reflection caught Daniel's eye. The woman in the photographs approached silently, her borrowed features set in an expression he recognized from 1,000 crisis photos. The look of someone about to do something desperate, something final. You can't fight what you are, the reflection said, spreading arms that were becoming less solid, more like beams of light given shape. What we are, what we've always been. The woman reached the reflection. Before it could turn, she pressed her hands against the back of its head. The touch seemed to disrupt whatever held the reflection together. Its form flickered, reality stuttering around it like a damaged film. The cave screamed. Not with sound, but with light. Brutal. Absolute. The kind that burns images permanently into camera sensors and human retinas alike. The watcher's voice exploded through Daniel's mind. No. What is captured must remain. What is seen must be kept. The reflection's form destabilized further under the woman's touch. Its features ran like wet ink, showing glimpses of everything it had been and could be. The eager young photographer, the hardened war correspondent, the thing that lived in the archive cataloging stolen moments. But in its dissolving face, Daniel saw something else. Fear. It could be hurt. It could be changed. It could be fought. The realization had barely formed when the reflection lunged at him, its body becoming a stream of negative images, of inverted light, of hungry darkness reaching to consume him. Behind it, the exit flickered like a shutter, each beat revealing a different escape, or a different trap. Daniel had a fraction of a second to choose, to move, to decide if he would fight, what he might become, or surrender to the inevitable progression of light into shadow, of observer into observed, of photographer into photograph. The reflection slammed into Daniel with the force of every photograph ever taken, every moment ever frozen, every reality ever split off from the main flow of time. They grappled in the disintegrating doorway, neither able to overcome the other. How do you fight something that is you, has always been you, will always be you? We are the perfect observers, the reflection hissed, its voice flickering between human speech and shutter clicks. We see what others can't, what others won't, what others shouldn't. Its hands, now more light than flesh, clawed at Daniel's camera, trying to tear it away. Every photograph is a door, every image a window, every moment a chance to let them in. But something glinted in the reflection's grasp. A photograph, dog-eared and worn, carried so long it had become part of its substance. The woman in the photographs moved with liquid grace, her borrowed features set in an expression of fierce determination. Her hands closed around the photograph and pulled. The image came free with a sound like reality tearing. The reflection screamed, not in pain but in loss. The photograph burst into flames that gave off no light, consuming itself in a matter of seconds. And as it burned, The reflection's form began to dissolve, its carefully constructed shell of borrowed moments and stolen light falling away to reveal the hollow thing beneath. "No," it wailed, its voice becoming less human with each syllable. "The moment. The image. Without it, I can't." The cave itself shrieked in protest. The walls peeled away like old photographs left too long in the sun, revealing the infinite dark beyond. The vast archive where every captured image was stored, where things made of light and shadow moved with terrible purpose through endless shelves of frozen time. "The cycle cannot be broken," the Watcher's voice thundered through Daniel's mind. "What is seen must be preserved. What is captured must remain." But the reflection was already collapsing, its form running like developer fluid, spreading out in a pool of silver nitrate and lost possibilities. As it dissolved, Daniel caught glimpses of other moments, other choices, other versions of himself that had stood in this exact spot and made different decisions. The exit behind him, the real exit, the last door, swung open. But with each passing second, it grew dimmer, less substantial, like an overexposed photograph fading to white. The woman in the photographs pointed urgently at the door, her movements leaving trails in the air like slow-motion capture. Her face, that beautiful, borrowed, impossible face, showed an expression Daniel had seen countless times through his viewfinder. The look of someone who knows they're about to sacrifice everything for someone else's escape. The floor beneath them gave way completely, opening onto the infinite archive below. The Watcher's presence pressed in from all sides, no longer patient, no longer willing to wait for Daniel's choice. Its camera eyes focused with terrible intensity, trying to capture him, to preserve him, to make him part of its vast collection of frozen moments and stolen souls. There was no time left for understanding, for revelation, for truth. No time to grasp the full horror of what lived behind every lens, what waited in the space between moments, what hungered for the light and shadow and silver that made up every photograph ever taken. There was only time for action. Daniel took one last look at the woman in the photographs, at her assembled face, her borrowed smile, her eyes that held the wisdom of countless captured moments. She nodded once, an acknowledgement, a blessing, a goodbye. Then he turned and ran for the fading door, leaving behind the archive, the void, the infinite collection of moments that might have been. Behind him, he heard the Watcher's scream of rage and hunger and loss, felt the pull of every photograph he'd ever taken trying to draw him back, felt the weight of every frozen moment trying to preserve him forever. But the door was there, growing dimmer with each step, threatening to fade completely before he could reach it. One chance, one moment, one final photograph waiting to be taken or escaped. Daniel burst through the doorway and fell face first into snow. For several long moments he simply lay there, feeling the cold seep into his clothes, grateful for the simple, physical sensation. When he finally pushed himself up, his hands trembling, he found himself exactly where he'd started, on the mountain ridge under a clear twilight sky. The blizzard had passed, or perhaps it had never existed at all. His camera hung heavy around his neck, somehow untouched by his ordeal. With shaking fingers, he pressed the playback button, dreading what he might see. The first images were exactly as he remembered taking them: the sunset over the Alps, the play of light on snow, the stark beauty of the mountain ridge. But every photograph he'd taken of the cave was gone. No antique desk, no oil lamp, no impossible room that shouldn't have existed. Even the shots of the rock face where the cave entrance had been showed only unbroken stone. He checked his watch, certain that hours must have passed. The display showed 5:47 p.m., exactly the same time he'd checked it before climbing toward that flickering light in the cave. Not a minute had passed. "It wasn't real," he whispered, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. His clothes were dry, unmarked by his desperate flight through the collapsing cave. His camera was intact, its memory card showing no evidence of what he'd seen. But something had changed. Something fundamental. Something irreversible. He could feel it in the way shadows moved at the edge of his vision, in the way light seemed to bend around certain angles, creating spaces that weren't quite empty, in the way every reflective surface held the possibility of eyes watching from just behind, the mirror. Almost against his will, he pressed the playback button one more time, moving to the very last image on the memory card, a photograph he knew he hadn't taken. The image showed him standing exactly where he was now, snow-covered ground stretching out before him. But there, just behind his right shoulder, stood a figure. It was blurred, unfocused, as if caught in motion, but he could make out the suggestion of a familiar face assembled from borrowed features, wearing an expression of infinite sadness and warning. The woman in the photographs, still watching, still warning. Daniel spun around, though he knew he would find nothing. The ridge behind him was empty save for wind-sculpted snow and lengthening shadows. But he could feel the weight of observation, the pressure of countless unseen eyes focusing on him through every lens, every reflection, every captured moment of light. His hands moved to his camera, an automatic gesture born of years of documenting the world. But they froze before touching it. What would he see if he raised the viewfinder to his eye now? What waited in the space between pressing the shutter and capturing the image? What watched from behind every photograph, hungry for the light and shadow and silver that made up reality itself? The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and shadow. Perfect light for photography. Perfect moments waiting to be captured, to be preserved, to be added to that infinite archive hidden behind reality. Daniel turned and began walking down the mountain, leaving his tripod still planted in the snow where he'd left it before climbing to the cave. He could buy another. He could buy 1,000 tripods. But he would never again be able to look through a viewfinder without wondering what looked back. Behind him, far up the ridge where no cave entrance had ever existed, a dim light flickered, once in the gathering darkness, like a lamp being lit, like a camera flash firing, like an eye opening. And somewhere, in the vast archive that existed in the space between moments, a new photograph appeared on an endless shelf. It showed a man walking away from a mountain, his camera hanging unused around his neck. Behind him, barely visible, countless faces watched from every shadow, every reflection, every captured moment of light. Some of the faces were his own. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.